Good evening. Welcome to a special edition of the Queen's Grapevine. This is your host, Wallingford. Tonight on the Queen's Grapevine, we want to talk about the educational system in New York City. This is the largest educational system that we have in the United States of America. And New York is such a wonderful town and a big town. We want to take the opportunity to do a follow-up on a program that we did about the educational system because it was very well received. Tonight in the Grapevine, we not only want to talk about the educational system, we want to talk a little bit about the Bloomberg administration running the educational system because he is responsible for it. The amount of things that he has done, we know for a fact that he has cleaned up the school system in terms of building new schools, getting rid of old schools and stuff like that, but he also has closed a lot of schools. He also has jumped and ride the unions and left a lot of things impending, but more importantly, we'll stay into the educational system because we know also that he has changed the way how to evaluate teachers in the system. And we want to find out, more importantly, why the scores are down. We happen to have our special guest with us who also happens to be an attorney and an educator, and it gives us a great deal of pleasure and satisfaction to have him on our program because the last program that we did about education, where he was our special guest, was very well received. I'm talking about Professor Jordan. Welcome to our program.
How you doing, Lee? It's always a pleasure to...
No, the pleasure's mine to have you, and one of the reasons why we decided to call you so much is because they like the point of view, and because you pull no punches, you call it the way you see it, and that's what we're looking for. Before we start talking a little bit about the Bloomberg administration, I want to find out, in your estimation, what is wrong with our educational system today?
Well, there are a lot of things wrong with our educational system. First of all, the mayoral control was a good idea when it was started because it was a response to the era of community school boards and control that had gotten totally out of hand. So when they started talking about the mayor assuming control, there was an accountability factor that many people like myself that had gone through community control were supportive of giving the mayor a little more. But what in fact has happened is the process of education has become corrupted. And the reason it's become corrupted is largely because there's an ongoing battle in this city between the teachers' unions, the mayor, the need for parental involvement, and what in the best scenario, all of those people should be working together, because I think if you were to ask the majority of those folks, they're all looking out for the good of the education to the children. The difference is that interest groups predominate. So for example, Mayor Bloomberg, the first thing he did was to start emphasizing control and testing, but testing not as part of a portfolio of accomplishment for students, only that they teach to the test, what became known as teaching to the test. Now, flawed strategy. First of all, education is the ability to develop critical thinking skills. So to expect a student just to be learning only about how to take a test is not the tool of an educator. And the mayor sort of bought into it, and even worse so, the grades dropped because that strategy was so flawed. What many like myself were supporting was an approach that included a portfolio of evaluating students. Okay, so you do well on a test or you don't do as well. How well do you do in other parts of the educational process with your teachers, etc.? And make a decision based that way as opposed to automatically these young kids go into these classrooms. They get taught, the teachers are afraid to deviate from what the standardized testing.
So they just want to follow what they're told.
They can't even experiment. They can't even say, well, let me see if this strategy will help these students understand better what's going on. So what they did is that they essentially undercut the educational process. Then you have the shifting of administrations. So you have the mayor reappointing people. You got from one person to another. You finally got Walcott in at one point. People remember Walcott came in. And there's a real concern in this city that, in fact, education, we are falling so far behind in education that we are not preparing the next generation to be able to have the skills to function in a high-tech society like the one we're in. And we're talking about a world competitive system where you have China, you have other countries that are starting to educate their children much more. And I'm disappointed, for example, the last grades, Black and Hispanic students disproportionately went low to the lower levels, went down.
Why is that, though?
Because this teach to the test approach, what it ends up doing is they kicked up the testing criteria to make them competitive.
Right.
And then what happens when these students take the test, they're taking a different test than the one they used to take. So the grades are going to show less of a score. And then what happens, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because then the next thing you do is the schools that don't have those kind of tests, you want to close the school. Right? You don't evaluate the school in terms of its performance. You evaluate the school, well, since they're not doing well in that test, we're going to close the school down. That's where the battles came in, because a lot of people in the city that are educated say, wait a minute, if you're going to close the school on the basis of the fact that it's not functioning, not because they didn't score the kind of grades, right? The other mistake I think Bloomberg made was he had these parental councils, but they never activated the parental councils. So
They were just there in name.
They were just their name only, so they pulled the parents out of the process. And most of us that are educated understand, even at that younger age, if your parents are not involved in your education, you're not going any place. By third grade, this is an interesting statistic, by third grade, if you don't finish at grade level by third grade, you will most likely drop out of high school. That's one step. And the people that take it further say that you may end up with a sizable portion of those folks may end up in prison.
Well, that backs up what I've always said to you, as we did in our first program, when we talked about that a parent has to be involved. To put all the pressure and responsibility on the teacher is somewhat irresponsible. You know, your education of a child should start from the moment you're pregnant, reading and that child hearing you when he was born and being totally involved. But you brought up a very important thing that I want to go back to. You stated that you felt that it was better when the mayor's office got involved into the education because you thought it was more positive, or you thought the old Board of Education was just bygone, or they weren't producing the way they were supposed to produce?
Yeah, what ended up happening, I was part of the early movements, and in the Bronx, people remember there was a woman by the name of Evelina Antonetti, and she struggled for community control. She said we should control the education of our children. It was a great idea. We should decide who's an effective principal and not. So it was a great idea at the time. It became a battleground between the UFT and the people that advocated for community control. When they did get some kind of control, after a while, unfortunately, that system started to become more corrupt. And some people started to use it, these community boards, to get principalships, to appoint people that were not based on merit. So then the system had to say, well, we got to figure out a way to deal against that. What they did was they took away all the power from community control, and they moved it towards centralizing the system, right? A necessary shift because people were getting crazy on a grassroots level. But so community control was an experiment that was never executed because parents never fully got to control the education of children. It shifted back to the Board of Education. The Board of Education, everybody knows, is an administrative nightmare. It's a bureaucracy that's totally out of control. I don't even know whether anybody could control the Board of Education with all its dimensions, and the many contracts that they have to negotiate. So now we move to a centralized system, and we go to a mayor that says, look, you give me control and I will fix all of this. But I think he was exaggerating, and people thought because he was a businessman and because he was worth $23 billion, that meant that he would necessarily be able to control that kind of a system.
Well, one of the things that held back Bloomberg, as smart as he is, and he's a very bright man, obviously, is that he thinks that, I'm not sure he understands everything about politics, because he wants to run everything as a business. And the educational system is a very complex thing. And to back that up, the biggest mistake that he made is hiring this lady by the last name of Black to run the school system, which is an outright disaster, even though he wants to be known as the educational mayor. How do you think that will play into his legacy, and where did he go wrong when he hired her?
Let me give you a classic example, right? He picked Black. Black had no educational experience. Black did not have the credentials to be the head of the school system. He had to get her an exemption. So the tragedy is here. We tell our young kids when we teach them, you study, because in this society, decisions are based on merit. And if you work hard in America, you can make it here. So now what's the first thing you do when you're the mayor that leads that system? You appoint somebody that doesn't have the credentials or the merit. To put that person in charge of the system, what are you telling the teachers? What are you telling the parents? That you have to go out, and because she's a personal friend of yours in the business community, that you're going to appoint. So now you've turned the education system back to a patronage system. And a lot of people were very uncomfortable with that.
Did the system lose momentum by she coming in?
It lost a lot of momentum. I think a lot of people pulled back, and even he realized that after a while he realized that there had been a mistake there. But you know what ends up happening in the mayor and being mayor, you're very aloof of what goes on a regular level. And I think one of the problems the mayor has, I don't think he necessarily understands what's going on at the community level. He interprets the world through what his staff people tell him. And one of the things
whatever is report back to him.
And you know, staff people, what they want to do is please you. They're not going to tell you, you know, you don't want to be the one that gives the negative prognosis or the negative message. So one of the things they've done is literally, look at this. I was a big advocate, and I believe it's still a great idea to have universal pre-K, right? And there's one candidate that's trying to tax wealthier people in the city to make sure that there's universal pre-K programs for all our young people. I think that's a great idea, because if these kids don't get it together in terms of reading, in the third grade is when you move from reading to comprehension. Before you get to third grade, you're learning about how to read in the process. Once you get into that third grade level, you start talking about, can you comprehend what you read? So now you're talking about thinking skills, right? And these kids are not getting in. Bad enough, I was never a big advocate of not letting the kids go to school for the summer. Because, you know, in a lot of our Caribbean folks, people go to school for 12 months.
Yes.
There's no 3 months off to go play and watch television, right? So that's the way they should have kept it. They should have kept that 12-month, pre-K, so that at a very early age, you're learning all those skills. Because it's a very competitive market, and these kids are going to have to compete. The world is shrinking, and our kids are not being prepared. And add to this what I call the racial subtext of this. The racial subtext is the presumption among some people that Black and Latino kids cannot learn.
Well, you know, it's scary that you mentioned something like that, because that's one of the concerns that I have. You read the daily news and the newspapers, and they talk about, all these scores, and the scores are so low, and the scores are low most in certain Latino areas and in the Black area. What does that say? What are they implying in a situation like that? Are children that are not learning because the school system is no good, or is it because of their mental capacity? What are they implying?
Well, I would say, obviously, that the problems are more structural. That the assumption that any kid can learn, I really believe that. You know, there are disabilities and things that you have to make in some cases. But in general, most young people can learn. That's the time when your mind is most open to anything. It's a sponge, literally, right?
And you're young.
And it's structural. So then what happens? People buy into the structural belief. So then they start thinking, because the school system is now so much Black, Latino, immigrant, that it's not the structure, it's the kids themselves. Now, you know that influences teaching. So if you're a teacher, and you go in with the mentality that your kids can learn, it affects their education.
Of course.
They've done experiments on these things, and they've told the teacher that her students were geniuses, and her teaching program is totally different than if you tell your teacher that your students are challenged, right? Right, because she teaches or he teaches differently. So what we got to do in many places, understand that it's structural. Our children can learn. Right, and you could tell, look, in the Caribbean and a lot of parts of Latin America, people don't like to hear this. People are learning reading, writing, and arithmetic better than they learn here.
Wow.
And people don't want to recognize that, because they crack the whip in a lot of these places. You know, my father used to go with me to school, and I always tell people this story. He would just tell the teacher, and I'm not advocating for corporal punishment, but what he would say is, look, you do what the teacher said, and would tell the teacher, look, if he doesn't do well, you let me know, because when he gets home, I'm going to hit him, right? But you can feel free to hit him too. Right now, don't say that we should go to that extent, but it's the notion of involvement, and I'm accountable for whether my children will learn or not. I'm not going to turn it over to the education system. I'm not going to turn it over to anything. Because one of the problems we have in our community is, well, if you say that the purpose of the system, unfortunately, is to miseducate our children, like some people believe, right? Then why would you turn over your kids to a system that's going to miseducate them unless you're going to do something yourself?
That's why, as a parent, you need to involve, and you need to be involved and must be involved, as you just mentioned. I want to go back to one part of it. When Black fell and she resigned, or whether she was forced out of the Board of Education system, Walcott took over. Has Walcott made a difference in the educational system, or has not been in there long enough, or you just happen to be a policeman for Bloomberg? What is your opinion about something like that?
I knew Walcott earlier because I know we have a mutual friend, and when he was with the Urban League.
Right.
And when we were in the Urban League, it had a totally different role, right? And some of the civil rights stuff he was doing was very positive. What happened was, I think this appointment was over his head in many respects. And the reason he got the appointment was largely because Bloomberg didn't have anybody else. And then people started saying that we're going to wait to see who you pick, so he had to go with Walcott as soon as. I don't think Walcott has made that much of a difference, but it's not him as a person. I never judge these people as individuals. They're part of a structure. And what he does is he has to try to negotiate with the UFT. He has to try to negotiate with the superintendents and the principals. He has to negotiate with the corporate sector to see what they're willing to fund to educate our children.
But is he prepared for such a big job like that?
I think he's over his head in many respects. And what ends up happening is then we get into a situation where he has to adopt or accept whatever the policy is.
Or learn on horseback as he go along.
Yeah, I don't think if you were to ask him, and this is my own impression, he's not a real teach for the test kind of a person. Because when he was at the Urban League, he didn't have that view.
Okay.
And all of a sudden, you become part of the structured thing, now teaching to the they wouldn't, by the way, they would never accept my characterization of teaching to the test, but that's what it is. They essentially, this is what's going to be on your test. We cannot discuss anything other than this. And then you have the pressure, so now you have teachers in some ways cheating. That's how bad it's gotten.
Wow.
You had a situation where, in fact, teachers won the investigation because they would come to the kids while they were taking tests and put their finger on where the answer was. Now, what kind of structure would create that kind of pressure? Like, why would a teacher feel so pressured? Why the teacher pressured? Because they know that they're the ones being blamed for the education system.
And they have to produce.
And they have to produce. So now they say they now have evaluations, but the evaluations is not clear whether they're evaluating the teachers
or the system,
or whether evaluating the system, or whether they're making excuses to prune the system of educators because there's not enough money to pay all these teachers, especially the aging population of teachers. They're costing the system a lot of money.
Very interesting, very interesting. When we get back in the Queen's Grapevine, we're going to continue talking to Professor Jordan, because one of the things that we want to get into is the responsibility of the teacher in the way that the teachers don't really truly get the respect that they deserve, because there are excellent and good teachers out there. And what we're advocating for is the proper teacher to be available to teach your student, to prepare them for the day of tomorrow, because they're the men and women of tomorrow. We'll be right back in the Grapevine as we continue talking about the educational system and why our children are not learning. We'll be right back on the Grapevine.
Every October, some 28,000 eighth graders line up to take a free but very challenging test.
I studied for months, every single day, since January till October.
Only 5,000 of them will score high enough to get a seat in one of the city's specialized high schools.
I took a test prep course, so I say I took about 6 or 7 practice tests. I don't think the test is really that difficult. You need to be able to get used to answering 100 questions in a certain amount of time.
While other high schools may ask about your grades or your attendance, the only thing that counts for the exam schools is your score on the test.
And we're back here in the Queen's Grapevine as we continue talking about the educational system in New York City, the impact that it has, the responsibility of the mayor, the responsibility of the chancellor, Mr. Walcott, and we're trying to get into the bottom of the responsibilities also as a parent who prepare your children to go to school, and the teachers, and why our scores are so low in the New York tri-state area, and why our children are not learning. Obviously, it's a very complex situation, but we just felt that it was important to talk about it. And we feel very lucky to have our special guest with us, Professor Jordan, who also happens to be an attorney discussing these type of sensitive issues, because I think it's important to you, the community, to know whether your children is learning, and the pros and cons, and the responsibility of the mayor on the system. The teachers don't have a contract right now. Okay, and that's kind of hanging because Bloomberg is coming out of office, and it's going to be left to the new guys, and whoever win, whether it be de Blasio, Lou, or Weiner, or even Lynn, who happens to be one of his protege. But one of the things that interests us at the most is how do we turn around the situation, and to what degree is the responsibility of the teachers, the learning of our children today?
Well, see, I think the teachers bear a certain amount of responsibility because, after all, they have the students 7 hours a day. But the problem that has developed is that there's been almost a demonization of the teachers in our school system. In my generation, we had teachers that their dedication was, you couldn't question their dedication to the students, right? And they would put in time, they would use their own money to buy school equipment for the students, etc. Now what happens? As the school system grows and the teachers' union becomes much more influential, then the people in positions of influence are trying to control the unions, but they blame the teacher for the education problem. Most of the teachers in our system are teachers that are dedicated to the children. And it's unfair with all these other things, teaching to the test, changing dynamics, resources, all these other things going on.
And the large classroom also.
And the classroom sizes being so large, going from very small individualized attention, right? Having no pre-K, you're going to blame students for teachers for everything that goes wrong with the system. I think most of the teachers in our system do a good job. What happens? They've got a lot more challenges. Now what happens? They have evaluations hanging over the head. But the problem was they tried those evaluations in California. Mm-hmm. And when they tried them, they did them on the same thing that they do with the students, they did with the teachers. Now you got to take a test.
Wow.
Right? So now if these teachers don't pass the test, they're open to questions as to their ability to teach. Now, a lot of us know that you could be a great teacher and you may not do well on a standardized test. Same way that you could be a great student. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And just because you didn't score well on one test, doesn't mean you were a bad student. Right? So what happened? Now these teachers feel like they're under siege. And now the mayor doesn't give them a contract. Why? Now, I could be a conspiracy theorist and basically say, well, look, you don't want your, in a baby boom generation with an aging bunch of teachers, you don't want to pay them what they're worth. So you'd rather bring in young teachers than pay them half the money.
And to me, that's very wrong. To me, that's very wrong.
Yeah. You can view it that way, but then you shouldn't blame the teacher. The teacher should be brought in the process. What we need is a partnership, essentially a partnership. Like if they want to think of business, think of partnership between the parent, the teacher, and the administrators of the school system. A partnership, but the partnership has to be based on mutual respect. When you come in and a student doesn't learn, and you're going to blame the teacher for everything. Now, that is not to say that there are not bad teachers. There are bad teachers, but every profession, I'm a lawyer. There are bad lawyers. There are lawyers that don't represent. There are bad doctors. You go to
bad
doctor, bad mechanics, but you don't blame 100,000 teachers because of some of the bad ones in the system, right?
I happen to agree with you 100%, and that's what's taking place here. The mayor's office of zeroing on attack the teachers. They don't have a contract. They are grossly underpaid. I repeat, grossly underpaid. And the mayor's office has taken a position to kind of try to wind out the older teachers, and it's totally wrong. The system has a lot of other problems instead of them just jumping on the teachers the way they have. Yes, if the teacher's incompetent and cannot produce, she's got to go. He or she's got to go because it's important to educate our children. But I don't appreciate the way the teachers are being viewed.
They're being scapegoated. Essentially, they're being scapegoated for all the fallacies in the system. And if you're going to evaluate, I'm in favor of teacher evaluations. But the evaluations have to be based on the teacher's ability. When you start doing straight up testing, right, and you make it only a test, I believe in the portfolio, what people call the portfolio approach. What you do is you judge a teacher in all the dimensions of what it takes to be a good teacher. Right? And you should be given more credit if you're a teacher that's willing to teach in low income, very difficult, high risk students. And one of the things we don't do is you get a teacher that's dedicated and spends hours of his or her time teaching these kids that are very difficult because they have a lot of problems at home, broken homes, the family dysfunctional, and they improve their grades. But they don't get anything more in our system. On the contrary,
they should be rewarded.
They should be rewarded for being able to. But instead, the system doesn't reward those students. What the system does is by giving that kind of pressure and not rewarding you, it pushes you out of the system. Because then you're a teacher and you're saying, look, I'm putting in so much time here. This is exhausting, right? This is stressful. What am I going to do? I'm not even getting a decent pay. Sanitation workers make more than teachers. Now, what did that tell you? And with all due respects to sanitation workers, but we're willing to invest more money in the people that pick up our garbage than the people that educate our kids.
That's exactly where I started this statement. It's a sad and pathetic situation. The teachers and professors, prepare the astronauts of tomorrow, the doctors, the lawyers, the bankers. How can teachers be so grossly underpaid? I don't understand the behavior of the Bloomberg administration, just going after them in a tremendous way. They don't even have a contract. And how can the Bloomberg administration get away with things like that?
Well, see, what ends up happening is, unfortunately, the collective bargaining system has created a real crisis because every union's contract is tied to every other union. So, for example, our union here, in the CUNY system is the Professional Staff Congress, right? We haven't had a contract in 4 years.
Wow.
Right? And what happens is the mayor is always watching because he or she knows that if they give a contract to one,
You have to
that
get to the
got
other.
together. So the contract they negotiate, so if we give them a high percentage, along are going to come the fire department, police, everybody else. So the idea is the first contract's always you lowball all the teachers or everything else. So then when everybody else has to accept.
We have approximately a minute and a half. Is there a message that you would like to give to our community here in New York in terms of how to better the education system before we sign up?
The message I would like to share is take personal responsibility for the education of your children. There are structural problems, there are union problems. We've talked here with Lee on some of those problems. But ultimately, if you're a parent, you are responsible for the education of your children. And you've got to go out and do whatever. If you have to home teach your children, then do that. But it's ultimately your responsibility. Anytime you turn over power over the education of your children to somebody else, what you're doing is dooming them to not be successful. It's your responsibility. We can struggle around education, school control, clothing, schools, a lot of those things. But when all is said and done, what takes place in that household, when you do your homework with your children, it will determine whether your children succeed or not.
And those very strong words, I want to add to it that you as a parent is ultimately responsible. Bond with your teachers, visit your teachers, find out about the condition of your students or your children to find out whether they are progressing. Take the phone calls that you get after 5 or 6 o'clock where the teacher called to let you know that your child has been slow in class or been left back. Take the call. The teachers are very responsible and they have done a great job and they deserve more credit than the Bloomberg administration has given them. In behalf of the family of the Grapevine, we just want to say thank you so much for watching this program and we hope that you have enjoyed it. And more importantly, it has been educational to you. Good night.